Hi. Hello. Welcome to Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Thank you for listening. It's good to be with you again. I hope everybody had a good week. How are you doing, actually? Just take a moment just to ask ourselves that. How are we? How are we doing? Are you doing okay? I hope so. All week long, I promised myself that in this intro, I would do my best to find maybe a more positive note than I have in the last few weeks. I feel like in the last few weeks, it's been all about hardship. And somebody criticized me about that. They're like white people problems. And on some level, it's true. These are like white people problems. But they're my problems and they're real problems. And they're what I have to deal with. And more, I'm aware of my white male privilege. And I'm bringing guests on to address that with me. I'll let you see who that is. But tonight, standing here, I just feel like I'd be lying if I tried to pretend otherwise that this week wasn't really that easier than last week. It was another hard week. And this week, for me, it's all about admitting to pain. I had this conversation with Neil Pearson yesterday, actually. I don't know if you guys know who Neil Pearson is. He's like a pain science guy. And we talked about pain. I don't want to give much away about the conversation. It'll come out in a few weeks. But one of the things that was mentioned is that a lot of people have more than one pain scale. We're talking about pain scales, like when you go to the doctor and the doctor asks you to rate your pain on a scale from 1 to 10. He was saying that a lot of people actually have two scales, and I think that's true of me, where we have a certain amount of what we just call discomfort. We don't really think of that as pain. It's only when it gets to a certain point that we actually decide to call it pain. When in fact, what we call discomfort is really just low-level pain. We just decide not to call it that, and we live with it, or we ignore it. And usually that's manageable for a long time. At some point it gets to a pain level. It starts to get in a way where it starts to impede your function, starts to get in the way of your enjoyment of your life. That's when we decide to call it pain. Well, that happened to me today. I have to admit, I'm standing here and I have physical pain right now. And that's not usual for me. I don't usually have a lot of physical pain. I'm usually in very good state physically. But tonight, I had no business teaching my yoga class with the kind of pain that I had. Fortunately, I knew everybody in class and I didn't need to demonstrate anything and I could sit on the stool, but still, just sitting there on the stool, I had pain that was distracting me to the point where it really didn't make a lot of sense. I really should have been at home, but I couldn't do that. And I think that I'm not the only one. I've written about this before in the past. I wrote a piece called Financial Realities and Occupational Hazards about how when yoga teachers teach so much, even when it's good for you at a certain point, it's just too much. We need rest. And today it just kind of came to a hilt. You see, it started in Switzerland a couple weeks back. Some of you who listen to the podcast know I was in Switzerland. And I was just working and traveling, and I felt like a little twinge of this pain. And I've had this pain before. I know this pain. It's happened to me 2 other times in my life. The first time was a very long time ago. It was very bad. It lasted a long time because I didn't understand it. I did all the wrong things to try to fix it and made it worse. The second time, it just reared a little bit. I noticed it. I knew what it was. I addressed it before it really became anything. And it was a big moment for me. I felt like I learned something about myself and I knew how to address this thing in me. Well, this time, it was surfacing and I knew it. And I thought I was kind of addressing it, but I was still just carrying a load. Like, I'm working so much these days, there wasn't a lot of room to do what I needed to do. So it was bothering me when I got back from Switzerland and I needed to rest, and I didn't rest because my wife worked. If you listen to the podcast, you know that as well. She worked a whole week. I did not rest. Well, actually, I rested some, But it was just like whenever I could, like I took all these naps and I thought, I'm resting, I'll rest it, But it would get better a little bit, like the pain would go down or even away and I would be functional, and then the pain would be back again because I never rested enough for it to really heal, just enough to get away with doing all this work. And then today I made this agreement with my wife that today would be the day I would take our youngest daughter so she could have some time to make some art, because she was feeling inspired. She wants to work on this stuff. She hasn't had a chance to do that, and I made an agreement to do that. So I couldn't really say to her, oh, I'm sorry, I can't do it today because I have pain and I'm a yoga teacher and I can't have pain if I want to do my job. Like I could just see her face if I was trying to say that to her. So I just toughed it out. And I didn't have any business doing what I did today, carrying her around and doing all the things we did. It was fun, but I was in pain while I was doing it and I knew it and I just ignored it because she was so adorable and I love her and I was doing this for my wife. And by the time I got to my class, I was like in a level of pain that was impeding my ability to like function the way I need to function. And I'm a little bit screwed because I let it go so far. And tomorrow I've got 2 classes and a teacher training meeting. The teacher training meeting is philosophy stuff. But still, I can't really cancel that stuff. So I'm going to have to muddle through. I'm going to go to bed as soon as I'm done recording this. I'm going to get through the weekend. On Monday, I've got the day off. I got to try to make some space. We got to rest, man. We got to rest. Okay, so what else? Oh, you want to one other thing that I talked with Neil about that was encouraging. He talked about all different kinds of ways to address pain. And one of the ways he kept coming back to was simple breathing and moving exercises. And most of you know that's sort of my specialty. So if you're listening to this and you want a source for some simple breathing and moving exercises, I know they're the ones that I'm going to be utilizing to help me along with resting to address my pain. And if you wanted some source for that, you could go to jbrownyogavideo.com and you could get that there. Also, if you wanted to drop me a note with a pain confession, if you want to just free yourself, I promise I'll keep them confidential. I won't read them on the air or anything. But if you've got some pain that you got to deal with, we got to admit to it. It's the only way we're going to address it. And then we got to find ways to be able to give ourselves what we need. It's not that it's a problem that I'm teaching people self-care, and yet I'm sacrificing my own self-care so I could teach other people to do their self-care. It's not really going to work. So I'm going to have to do some assessment. I'm going to have to take off some hats. I've got too many hats, and I'm going to have to take off some hats. And I have to talk to my wife, and we're going to have to figure out a new time schedule, I think. So, all right. Today's talk is, look at what I did. You see? I wanted to be positive, and then I just went totally hardship. But what am I going to do? That's the honest truth. That's the only way, the honest truth. So, anyways, today's talk is with Hari-kirtana. And Hari-kirtana does not have the same philosophical viewpoint as me, and we have a very engaging conversation where we go toe-to-toe on some stuff, some yoga philosophy, which was really fun. It's something I really hoped would happen on this podcast, and I think Hari-kirtana is probably one of the first people that I felt like that happened, so I'm excited to share it with you. I do want to mention something. Hari-kirtana talks about his experiences in several different spiritual communities. One, he talks about being a Hare Krishna. He's very much knowledgeable about that organization. He was actually one of those guys at the airport back in the day, if you remember. I know he's going to kill me for saying that because that's not all that it is, as we will learn from the talk. But he was one of those guys at the airport, and he's very open about his experience. He also talks openly about his experience at Jivamukti, which he did teacher training there. I mentioned last week he did teacher training with Holly Faroe. Holly Faroe is the person who filed the lawsuits against Jivamukti Yoga Matthew Remski talked about it last week. Well, it's important to mention that there's been some news about that. Since this was recorded, news has come out that the case has been settled. There was a settlement between the plaintiff and the defendant. It is non-disclosed, so we don't know the details of that, but it is settled law. The case is no longer pending. So Hari-kirtan's views were expressed before that news came out, and I just think you should know that. I don't really have much to say about this story or issue right now. I've got some guests coming on. I've got Annika Lucas from Liberation Prison Yoga coming on, and I'm going to wait. We're going to talk about some of these abusive power issues then. Okay, my friends. Again, really appreciate your contact. Thank you so much for listening. And let's talk to Hari-kirtan. Hello, Hari-kirtana Das. How are you, my friend?
I'm well. How are you?
It's good to speak with you. You know, we've had exchanges online over the last few years, but I did meet you once in person, at least once I know, long before that. Do you remember that?
I do. We met actually a couple of times at the home of our mutual friend, artist extraordinaire Mia Perlman.
That is correct. So
I still lived in Brooklyn, yeah.
I see. Well, the time that I remember most was her wedding.
Yes.
And I remember that wedding, I was cold. It was kind of cold. I do remember we spoke, though, and what I remember, first of all, is that you were not introduced to me as Hari-kirtana Das, if I remember. You were introduced to me by another name.
Yes. I've had numerous names throughout my life, too many to keep track of. And I also have a previous career as an artist, and a corporate career and a music career and so many other lives. And I've had different names associated with each of those. So yes, the first time you met me, I was living under one of my other names on account of living a different life than I'm living now. Now everyone knows me as Hari-kirtan.
Yeah, well, I want to get to that. But before we get to that, because when I met you at that wedding, what I remember you telling me was that you were making this video for Jivamukti.
Yes.
And I remember seeing the video after you made it. It was like on their homepage for a while.
Yeah, it was their kind of a promotional video right on their homepage, on their old website, right?
Right. And then it also makes me think, because there is this recent Jivamukti thing, which we can get to a little bit later, but in your comments about that, you mentioned that prior to being at Jivamukti, so prior to that time when you made that video for them, you had already been in other sort of yogic orders or other schools of yoga. And I'm curious, so that's maybe I thought where we could start, like where was your entrance into yoga? Like where did it start and when did it start for you?
My entrance into yoga was pretty early. I had a spontaneous interest in yoga and spiritual ideas, the idea of yogic mysticism and such, from pretty early on. Doctor Strange was my favorite comic book. I wanted to go and study with the Ancient One. I had an intuitive sense of the nature of the difference between spirit and matter pretty young. Someone explained to me something about the law of conservation of energy in physics. I'd gotten interested in Albert Einstein or something when I was a kid.
Like how young? How young?
Like 10 years old.
10 years old you were interested in Albert Einstein? That's crazy. Well, I mean, I don't remember I wasn't interested in Albert Einstein at 10, so that your mind was already that direction.
It was more a matter of growing up Jewish on Long Island, you know. Einstein is Jewish, you're Jewish, therefore you will be as brilliant as Albert Einstein. You know, it's that kind of thing.
I see.
But once someone talked to me a little bit about what physics was and what it meant, I understood as soon as I heard this that I was eternal. Because if energy cannot be created or destroyed, then I cannot be created or destroyed because I am a form of energy. That was my thinking process. I couldn't really articulate that at the time, 10 years old. How much can you really articulate? But I remember having a distinct realization at that time that I was a form of energy of some kind, and therefore the law of conservation of energy applied to me somehow. And then around the same time, that was when the Addams Family sitcom was on television.
Yes, I watched it as a kid. I remember it.
And Gomez Addams was my hero, my role model. I wanted to be Gomez Addams when I grew up. And he was the president of the Yoga Society, which in the mid-1960s was just testimony to his eccentricity, because yoga was something that only eccentrics did. And as far as I know, he's the first person, fictional or otherwise, to actually do yoga asana on primetime television.
Wait a second, I didn't know that. So on that show, that character is like a yoga guy?
Yeah. Yeah, he's doing headstand, he's doing lotus poses. There's a few episodes where you'll catch him actually doing asana in his living room, in his suit.
Wow, that's amazing. I missed that episode. Or if I saw it, it didn't register with me. But that's crazy. I didn't even remember that.
You can find him on YouTube, I think.
Wow.
Anyway, so
your yoga was modeled after seeing it on the Addams Family, kind of? That was your inspiration?
Yeah. Well, it was the perfect combination of spiritual eccentricity and total weirdness. Anyway,
that's awesome.
As I got a little older, I started reading. I read Siddhartha when I was 14, and that's when I knew that my spiritual direction was going to point towards India. Mm-hmm. And I started reading other books by J. Krishnamurti and Alan Watts, and just sort of going around the usual group of readings and teachers for people who are inclined toward that sort of thing at that age when they become a teenager. My first actual yoga asana was from I stumbled across the Illustrated Book of Yoga, and there were yoga asana poses illustrated in the back of Be Here Now.
That's right.
And
the illustrated book was just big pictures of asanas. This was like
I couldn't really make much of the instruction, but I looked at the pictures and I did what I could.
Right.
My interest in spiritual life kind of hit a peak when I was in from the period between graduating high school when I was 18 and when I was 21. I'd always had a circle of friends who were interested in this sort of thing, and some more than others. Two of them, one of my good friends, immediately after high school, became a Hare Krishna devotee. And I thought that was one hit of acid too many for someone. That was just a little more than I could handle.
The chanting was cool. That was fun. And the vibe was cool. Good, but the whole give up everything, that wasn't working for you?
Well, my aspirations to be a drummer in a psychedelic rock and roll band kind of took precedence over the idea of complete material renunciation.
Gotcha.
And I had trouble wrapping my head around the philosophy because it seemed to be telling me that God was a little blue flute-playing cowherd boy. And I thought, that doesn't even qualify as mythology. That's like fairy tales. That doesn't even look like yoga to me. It looks like sentimentality.
Yeah.
And years later, I started chanting the Hare Krishna mantra. I had a job. Once upon a time, there was no internet. And the only way to get a document from one office building to another office building was to mimeograph it. Look it up, everyone.
Wow.
Mimeograph the thing. And then package it up and give it to someone and walk across town and take the document, the physical document, to the office. And that was my job. I was a foot messenger in Manhattan, and all day long I took documents from one office building to another office building, and I made it a walking meditation by synchronizing my breath, my gait, and mentally chanting this Hare Krishna mantra. And it was from that practice that I got my first real big aha breakthrough moment. Earlier on, I had already understood the concept of karma. In fact, I had told my mother when I was 16 that I was going to become a vegetarian because I didn't want the bad karma associated with killing animals. Her reply was, "You will eat what I cook or you won't eat." And she wanted to see if I was serious, and I think she was also buying time to figure out what she would feed me if I was. And I called her bluff and said, okay, I won't eat. I was a skinny 16-year-old teenager. I knew she wouldn't last. 3 days later, she's making me vegetarian casseroles. So I understood the idea of karma. But one day, while I'm walking on the south side of 42nd Street from 6th to 5th Avenue with Bryant Park directly to my right, I got halfway down the block and it was like the sky opened up. And the message was, you are responsible for innumerable lifetimes of karma, and you are doing nothing about it. And it was at that point that I just stopped and thought, wow, that this now has to be the priority of my life. I am not interested in fielding the reactions to my past actions for innumerable lifetimes that I don't even know what they are. And I attributed this realization to changes I was making in my life, specifically the result of chanting this mantra all day long, every day, for weeks. So
Well, let me jump in for a second, because, when you talk about that practice that you had of basically like walking through the streets of New York chanting a mantra, I know that. I had it wasn't the Hare Krishna mantra, it was another mantra, but I remember a distinct period of time where I was in sort of a deep practice where I needed to really have discipline. And so keeping my mind right, on my way to teach or on my way to class, I would always be chanting this mantra while I was walking down the streets. And it was very deep practice to do it, because you're in the city and it's just like such a commotion. And to sort of keep the focus of your mind and your breath and your gait and the mantra while in that always felt very powerful to me. So I hear how that might have led to a clear communication of sorts that you got, right?
Yeah, especially if you're, walking in a busy place like Manhattan. It's like walking within the eye of a hurricane. Everything else is moving at high, crazy speed all around you, and you've got this kind of calm space that is like a bubble that you're walking in.
That's exactly what it felt like, and it was very powerful to have that. It felt very like I was developing a facility with myself that would enable me to stand in that kind of space. Yeah. So I can definitely appreciate how you would have that experience. But yours took you a little different place than mine.
Well, it did, yes. It took me to the Hare Krishna temple and the Hare Krishna ashram. And
was that the one on 3rd Avenue? Wasn't there one over there, like on the...
This one was on 55th Street.
Okay.
Between 8th and 9th Avenue.
Okay.
And they had a restaurant downstairs, and I was eating at the restaurant like every night, because at the time, even in New York City, finding really good vegetarian cuisine was not easy.
I guess Angelica Kitchen wasn't open yet, right?
I don't think so. The Paradox was closed, and it was not. It wasn't a time when that was really in vogue the way it is now. And I took a second look at the philosophy, and what I found was that even though the conclusion seemed preposterous, there was a very sound and comprehensive philosophy that supported this conclusion. And the more I dug at it, the less fault I could find with it. And to this day, I still haven't found a philosophy as sound or comprehensive that explains my experience of the world as completely as that philosophy. So I spent the next 4 years, 24/7, full-time, pedal to the metal bhakti yoga, in the Hare Krishna Temple in New York and other various intentional spiritual communities. And that's where I got my training in yoga philosophy and its companion philosophies, Sankhya and Vedanta. There wasn't much of an asana practice at all. In fact, my physical practice consisted of dancing and Tai Chi.
Chanting, right?
Yeah, you're chanting and dancing. It's a great cardio workout to get up at 4:30.
Well, chanting is just pranayama.
You're really doing some serious energy circulation while engaging in hearing and chanting transcendental sound. So you get a combination of great energy work and purification of your consciousness and your heart at the same time. So it's a very powerful practice.
And so when you go into the Hare Krishna organization like that, does that mean like surrendering over all your worldly possessions and everything?
It can. Nowadays, it's very different. What I'm describing now in the 1970s is a very different Hare Krishna movement from what you have now in 2016. At the time, everyone was an American, Western, young person. You may have renounced everything, or you may have just left everything at your parents' house. For me, I had nothing. I was at a point in my life where everything had come to a standstill and a kind of a dead end. It turns out that a career as a drummer in a psychedelic rock and roll band is not always the most lucrative career path. So it wasn't like I really had a lot to give up. Yeah. I was in a position like, well, what, do I have anything better to do right now? No. Okay.
I remember at one point, my life got reduced down to literally like one big army duffel bag, like a box, and like a guitar. Like that, at one point, like my life was down to that. So there really wasn't much to give up. I totally get it.
Exactly. That was my situation minus the guitar.
Yeah. Mine was a bass. It was a bass. But yeah, still,
details. Anyway, so now two things are happening at the same time. In the 1970s, I am among a bunch of young people who are all very sincere in their pursuit of spiritual life. I am learning a very authentic practice connected to an ancient tradition. So I'm learning the Bhagavad Gita, I'm learning the Bhagavad Purana, also known as the Srimad Bhagavatam. I'm learning how to chant the transliterated Sanskrit. I'm hearing philosophy classes twice a day, and I'm practicing all day, every day for 4 years. And this now lays down the foundation for my entire worldview and gives me a complete education in the tradition of Bhakti Yoga philosophy that is going back through an entire lineage of teachers. And it's something that any academic who specializes in the study of Indian spirituality or Indic studies of any kind can verify as a totally authentic tradition.
Yeah.
But there's something else here.
Can I ask you one more question? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead. Yeah.
My question is, like, when you say that doesn't go with the image that I think people have of Hare Krishna, like at the airport.
And that's exactly where I'm going with this.
Okay, because that's like a different picture of what the Hare Krishna thing is. So
right, of
please
course
continue.
At the same time, now this is the most valuable, important experience of my life. And it happens within the context of being a member of the mother of all cults.
Yeah.
Because I was a full-on, shaved-up, orange robe wearing Hare Krishna. People from Kansas, tourists who come to New York City, would stop me on the street and say, can we take our picture with you? Because, part of the New York experience is running into a Hare Krishna. And it wasn't a cult because there was some sinister design to control the minds of America's young people. It was a byproduct of spiritual immaturity. It was all young people. The only real adult in the Hare Krishna movement was the founder, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who was old enough to be almost everybody's grandfather. Mm-hmm. So you had this gap, you had this maturity gap. And it took a long time for the leaders of the Hare Krishna movement to be able to step away objectively enough to look at themselves and see how someone outside the Hare Krishna movement saw the Hare Krishna movement, and to realize, oh yeah, if we walk like a cult and quack like a cult, then everyone's going to think we're a cult. Now things have changed rather dramatically because there are so many Indians who practice the philosophy of Krishna consciousness who come to the Hare Krishna temples. Now it's a respectable subcategory of Hinduism. But at the
so
time,
when you were in it, you didn't even think of it as Hinduism?
No. In fact, the philosophy of Krishna consciousness regards Hinduism as a temporary material designation, just like Judaism or Islam or any of the varieties of Christianity. I can be born Jewish, convert to Christianity one day, adopt Hinduism the next, or become a Muslim the day after that. But it doesn't change my status as an eternal spiritual being with an eternal relationship to the Supreme Being. So Hinduism is actually seen as a temporary material designation, and our eternal relationship with Krishna is seen as a transcendental relationship, a relationship that transcends all temporary material designations.
Okay, so what's the disconnect? Why in the movies do we see the Hare Krishnas at the airport like that?
Well, because most of those movies are old.
So you think that it was more like that, and then they've changed that now, and they don't do that anymore? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. It's a pretty different mood and a very different organization.
But when you were there, they were going to the airport, right?
When I was there, I was going to the airport.
So you were at the airport too. So you did both things. So you did deep study, and then you also went to the airport. And what was the airport about? What was that? Was that part of the practice?
The airport, the Hare Krishna movement is different from much of the rest of what one would consider Hinduism in that it's evangelical. So it's designed, it's part of the practice actually, to share the teachings and offer them to others. The economic model of the institution, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, was based on this idea of distributing the books of the founder Acharya of the Hare Krishna movement. So that was the economic engine. Unfortunately, in their youthful overzealousness, the methodologies by which this distribution of books took place warped into a kind of annoyance, to say the least.
They just kind of give it to you and then try to hit you up for the money, right?
Yeah, it's free. Give a donation.
Yeah, they did that thing. That was always not so good. That wasn't a good way to do it. It wasn't a good way to do it.
And I could see even then, I could see, and I was never good at book distribution. And the reason I wasn't good at it is because I had a lot of trouble getting enthusiastic about something that I thought was less than entirely honest in its approach, and was pretty much guaranteed to end up being a very bad PR move. From a standpoint of public relations, it lent neither authority or trustworthiness to the Hare Krishna movement. I
agree. I have a distinct memory of being in not Washington Square, in the East Village, and having a nice conversation, a philosophical conversation about yoga with a Hare Krishna, and it was wonderful. But because there ended up being kind of a hard sell on the book in the end, it diminished it for me. I mean, it didn't represent it well. I think you're right.
Yeah, and I expected that would have to be the case, even though I was still pretty young at the time, and I certainly didn't have any position within the organization to affect any change. If I had said anything to the effect of "this is not right," then I think the response would have been "you're in Maya, Prabhu," and meaning that I was in some kind of illusion or something, or I wasn't really a team player, I wasn't really getting it. Anyway, eventually the economic model changed from a book distribution model to a we sell stickers at concerts and baseball games model, which really did not work out very well at all, to a congregational support model. People with a little more vision understood that as the younger members of the counterculture grew up, The appeal of the Hare Krishna movement would shift from disaffected young people to members of a growing Indian community for whom this would be totally familiar and who would approach it from a completely different context. This is their culture, this is their religion. Mm-hmm. And so now you have a very different kind of experience when you go to a Hare Krishna temple. Most of the people who practice Krishna Bhakti do not live in the temples. They live outside, whereas when I first moved into the temple, either you were in the temple or you were not. It was a real black and white thing. Somewhere in the middle there, you also had this curious thing where a subset of the hardcore straight edge community also became attracted to the Hare Krishna movement.
I've seen that. I've seen like the Ron Paul folks or whatever. Like I totally know what you mean. There is like an oversect. I think because there is philosophy behind it that is appealing, particularly at a particular time in your life when you're trying to figure out who you are in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember coming back and going to CBGB's and seeing a band called Shelter, which was a group of straight-edge, hardcore Hare Krishnas, and I was like, really? This is what the Hare Krishna movement looks like right now? It's
wow.
A bunch of kids with tattoos and bead bags chanting Hare Krishna and then like slamming into each other in the mosh pit? That's what... Anyway, wow. It's kind of a curious...
All right, well, so how long were you in the Hare Krishna organization?
Well, I've bounced in and out from a standpoint of any official position. Like I lived in the temples for almost 5 years, and then I left, and my practice was kind of in or out.
What did you do when you left? Where did you go?
I went back to playing music, mm-hmm. and then I realized that I was approaching 30 years old, and I had no college degree, no training in anything that anyone would pay me for.
You knew a lot about yoga philosophy, though.
Yeah, I knew a lot about yoga philosophy. It wasn't easy to get a paying gig as a expert in yoga philosophy.
Yeah, no.
Now it's a little easier. I managed to make a career out of that somehow now.
Wow.
But
yeah, we'll talk about that later.
I realized, hey, I need to figure out how I'm going to make a living in the world, and I managed to find my way into what was then the new field of computer graphics, and I built a career as a computer graphics artist, and mm-hmm. eventually stepped over into the marketing and sales side of computer graphic systems, and that was my career, working for various companies in that field.
I know when you mentioned your video that you're making for Jivamukti, which is before it kind of came out at Mia's wedding, that mm-hmm. was definitely before video was as ubiquitous as it is now on the internet.
Yes.
That was ahead of the curve, because I remember nobody had a video yet, and you were making one for them.
Right. Yeah, and it was specifically designed for their website.
Right.
And for
now everybody has one of those now.
Yeah, now of course
everybody's got a Kickstarter style video for their website, whatever it is.
Yeah, at the time that was new, and that was how I got started with Jivamukti.
And so is that how you originally found your way to them, to work with them in a marketing capacity?
Well, yeah. What happened was my friend Joshua Green, who was teaching Bhagavad Gita classes at the Jivamukti Yoga Studio, mm-hmm. invited me to lunch with the manager of the studio. And when he introduced me, he said, Hari-kirtana is a video editor and video producer. And the manager at Jivamukti said, that's great. We need a video. Let's talk. Mm-hmm. And so I gave him a proposal, and he said, we can afford to pay you half of this amount to produce this video. Can we do a barter deal and give you the rest in yoga classes? It was a lot of yoga classes.
I bet.
It was a lot of yoga classes. And I said, yeah, I'll do that. That'll work for me. Yeah. It was the two of us, actually, my partner and I. So she wasn't as interested in doing the yoga classes. She did some, but not as many. So I got the benefit of some of her free yoga classes as well. And I did a lot of private yoga with the teachers there. And I loved
and that was at the center on Lafayette, is that right?
No, that was already
at the new place over on Union Square.
Just to the place in Union Square.
Okay.
And I loved the practice. Mm-hmm. It felt great. It was a really complete, comprehensive, very vigorous practice. It just felt like it got everything. But I also took note of the format. Mm-hmm. The format is you do some chanting, you speak a little bit of yoga philosophy, you integrate the yoga philosophy into the asana practice, you do meditation at the end. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I need to teach this. I need to make this a platform so that I can teach what I know from 30 years ago.
So the asana practice became also like a way for you to also explore the philosophy and the teachings there that you really were most interested in.
Yeah, I realized that if I can stand on my head and teach other people how to stand on their heads, then they'll think I know something about spiritual life, and then they'll accept me as an authority, and I'll tell them.
Wow, interesting.
So what happened was I went to India, and one of my teachers in India said to me, Hari-kirtana, you need to find a way to be a teacher. It would be good for you. It's your nature. You'll be happy doing it, and you'll be of service to others. Figure it out. Figure out how to become a teacher. And that was the last straw. Mm-hmm. I came back. I signed up for the Jivamukti Teacher Training, mm-hmm. and I did the training and started teaching in 2009. And that's when my contemporary yoga career actually began.
And you were teaching at the center there in Union Square?
I never taught there because by that time, first of all, I'd already moved to Washington, D.C. I'd been practicing for a few years. There was a teacher here in Washington, D.C. who taught Jivamukti Yoga, and she was wonderful and is still a dear friend. And I started taking her classes. And then I signed up for the training. But my approach to Jivamukti Yoga was a little different than probably most other Jivamukti Yoga teachers. For one thing, I was a lot older. I'm close to Sharon Gannon and David Life's age, the founders of Jivamukti Yoga. We probably went to the same shows because I found out we liked the same bands. Yeah. There's a real good chance Sharon actually was my waitress at the Life Cafe at one point. Mm-hmm. My approach to Jivamukti Yoga was that I was not there on the basis of ideology. Mm. I was there on the basis of this is a business decision because this is going to give me the platform that I need and the format that I need. And it will also give me immediate brand name recognition. People will come to my classes because it's a Jivamukti Yoga class, not because it's a Hari-kirtana class.
You were just garnering like tools and resources.
Basically, yeah. Mm-hmm. Because I already had a firm grounding in yoga philosophy. I understood. Now, here's the thing.
Now, wait, because they have a very specific
yoga
philosophy they teach, and I don't know that it's the same as...
It's not. It's right? Totally not.
So how did that go for you during the training? You just kind of were undercover and incognito and didn't make any waves?
Well, I made gentle waves. Because I went to Sharon specifically, and they knew where I had been.
From, yeah.
So there was no secret there. And they understood that there was a distinction between the philosophy that I embraced and some elements of the philosophy that they were teaching. And I made it clear to Sharon that if I ask a question, it's not a challenging question. It's a question where I want to understand how you are thinking, how you come to a particular conclusion, just so I get the background.
I'm the same way. When I want to learn, I kind of challenge them, and I want to see how they react.
Well, I
was always a punk like that. It's just sort of like how I was.
Right.
I don't know if that's the best student, but I always wanted to see, and the teachers who helped me the most were the ones who are like, okay, fine, you can take your shot, and it didn't faze them,
And that's how Sharon approached it. I wanted to be clear that I was being respectful. And I wouldn't ask any leading questions or anything like that, that I really just wanted to understand their thinking, which also indicated to them that it's not necessarily that I'm going to buy your explanation. I just want to understand it.
Yeah, that's a sincere inquiry. I think that's respectable.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, because, Hare Krishnas have a little bit of a reputation of being kind of in your face about things. I wanted to make sure that they knew I wasn't coming from that place. Otherwise, why am I wasting their time taking their training?
Yeah. You paid for the thing, right?
I paid for the thing. I'm going to take the seat of the student
yeah.
in your training. Now, but here's the thing. I approached the training from a pretty different frame of reference than most of the other people who approached the training, because I already had a firm grounding in yoga philosophy. I'd been studying and practicing, trying to live that philosophy for the better part of the 30 years prior to my training. And I had also been a member of the mother of all cults.
And you just had more life. You're older than everybody, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I had more life experience than most.
You're in a different life stage.
So when I walked into the Jivamukti training, I could look at the whole thing and I could say, been here, done this, bought the tilak. You know, I know I recognize what I see here in terms of.
And so what is that? What did you see? Because that gets to this recent thing that's going on, right?
Right. What I saw is two things: a legitimate connection to a spiritual tradition and a cult of personality. Mm-hmm. And I knew how to navigate through that in a way that I could take the benefit and not get caught up in the downside that goes with that territory, because I'd already been through that kind of territory. Mm-hmm. So I knew how to navigate it. And I also knew that even if there is some kind of, hippie cultiness to the whole experience, that would not negate the positive, because the message and the method have great value.
A lot of people benefit from Jivamukti Yoga. I benefited from Jivamukti Yoga in my life, so...
Mm-hmm. So
Well, the question is, though, question on the table with the issue, and I don't know if anybody listening to this knows the whole story, but there's a pending court case, and the issue for me, I mean, all the legalities of it are not something I really studied deeply into, so I can't speak to that. Matthew Remsky's studied more into that than I have, and he I think has been on this podcast the week before you, but what I would say is that, to me, it does come down to kind of the issue of manipulation. Is there this manipulation going on, and these boundaries being crossed that could even verge into harassment, or is it human frailty and just the what happens when you have these kinds of situations? I don't know. You've been in these kind of communities more than me, so what's your impression of the court case and based on your experience having been there and seeing what happens? Do you think that there's legitimate claims against Jivamukti?
Holly Farod, who's filed the lawsuit, was in my teacher training.
You knew her?
And that's how I know her.
Okay.
Now, I don't know her super well, but I know her, and I know some of her very closest friends even more. So, based on my knowledge of Holly as a person and giving all due consideration to the issues from as many angles as I can possibly have been able to think of them, what is logical, what is the culture of Jivamukti Yoga like, what is it, and by Jivamukti Yoga, I mean very specifically the mothership in New York and the close circle around Sharon, Gannon, and David Life. Because the culture of Jivamukti Yoga in New York City at the Jivamukti Yoga school is not the same at all as the culture of the Jivamukti Satsang here in Washington, D.C. The mood here is very, very different. It's not a reflection of that same mood that you have at the mothership. So that's one thing I want to point out. But getting back to your question, I am obliged to think that the allegations in Holly's complaint are so much more likely to be true than not true that, as a matter of faith, I will accept them as true. There are plenty of things that we've never actually seen personally in our lives, and yet reasonableness dictates that we will accept that it's true. There are such things as subatomic particles and black holes. I've never seen them, but I'm going to accept that as an article of faith based on reason and logic and verbal testimony. that this is true. So I think I think her claims are credible. I am not pleased with the response from the Jivamukti Yoga School. I understand where that response is coming from, but I'm not particularly happy about it. Now that the case is in the courts, there's I'm sure that the time you can't roll back the clock.
It's going to play out.
It's got to play out, and it's got to play out the way the lawyers say it's going to play out now.
Right.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.